Alright, so the reason I'm making this video is for you guys to be able to kind of review everything we've gone over this quarter. So this video is everything we've talked about as far as cells and characteristics of life go. So here we go. We're going to go ahead and get started with characteristics of life. One of the first characteristics of life we talked about was organization, and that said that all living things are made of cells. And in addition to that, in multicellular organisms, special cells have special jobs. One way you can remember what the organization characteristic of life is, well, you see like the root word of organization is organ. And later on in the quarter we talked about cells, tissues, and organs. So that might kind of remind you of that. Also, you can think about multicellular organisms being kind of divided up and organized by the cells that they have. So lung cells are in the lungs and heart cells are in the heart. They don't serve other purposes throughout the body. So they're kind of organized throughout the body. Alright, the second characteristic of life we have is growth and development. And that says when an organism grows, they increase in size. So for a unicellular organism, an organism that's just a single cell, for it to grow, that means the cells itself have to increase in size. However, for multicellular organisms, it's a little bit more complicated. Actually, the number of cells increases. So a multicellular organism starts off as a single cell, but just keeps adding more and more and more and more cells. The development part of growth and development just means that as the organism grows older, it changes. So for example, going from a tadpole to a frog is an example of development. The third characteristic of life is reproduction. And that says one organism makes one or more new organisms. And without reproduction, the organism species would go extinct. Now, the important part there is the organism species is going to go extinct. So think about it. If humans suddenly all stopped having babies, obviously, of course, the human population would decrease, and eventually there'd be no humans left. That's not the case if just one human stops having a baby. We don't go extinct. It's the whole humans as a species. Fourth characteristic of life is going to be response to stimuli. You can think of a response as being like a reaction. So a response to stimuli is just reacting to things happening inside or outside of your body. Now here's 4 examples. So one being temperature. I feel like you guys are all kind of familiar with your body reacting to different temperatures. When it's hot out, you can tell. When it's cold out, you start to shiver. So that's your body reacting to that. Also, sunlight. When it's very bright out, your eyes kind of squint. That's reacting to the bright light. And also, hunger can kind of happen in 2 ways. You can feel hunger from inside your body. Your body will tell you that it's time to eat. But also, smelling certain things, like certain foods that you like, will make you feel hungry. So that's an example of internal and external stimuli. The 5th characteristic of life is a little bit more complicated, but it says that an organism's ability to maintain stable internal conditions, that's homeostasis. For example, now humans are able to control their body temperature, and we know this, that again, when it's hot, we start to sweat, and when it's cold, we shiver. That's our body's way of keeping our temperature in our body balanced. So we can think of this stable internal conditions as being like a balancing point. So the body has to keep a relatively balanced temperature. It can't go too high, it can't go too low. Finally, the 6th characteristic of life is going to be use of energy. And this is a simpler one. It just says that organisms use energy for all the activities they do, and they can either make their own energy or they can get it from eating something else. Now, here's some of the more important things. I want to give you an example of all of these 6 characteristics of life happening in plants, because I think they're pretty good examples to kind of take back and kind of remember. So let's start with organization. Remember, organization said that multicellular organisms have different cells for specific jobs. So for example, in the plant, there's certain cells in the roots that help pull in water and nutrients from the soil. There's certain cells in the stem that help support the plant and make it grow up tall. And then there's certain cells in the leaves that help it gather light and to make food. Reproduction. Let's see. So the big plant started off as a small seed, and that seed came from another plant before it. So the plants are able to produce these seeds, right? And then that grows another plant. So the plant keeps reproducing and making new basically copies of itself. Growth and development, again, kind of the same line. The big plant started off looking just like the small plant. As it grew, as it gained more cells, since it's multicellular, it developed and changed a little bit, and it becomes the plant that you see there. Response to stimuli. What's kind of interesting is plants have a cool sense. So they're able to actually track the position of the sun. One cool example is sunflowers are actually able to basically point at the sun when it's in the sky. So you can watch time-lapse video of sunflowers actually moving throughout the day and like following the sun. Another cool example is the roots of a plant actually have a natural way of sensing gravity, so they go down naturally, down into the ground, or they can also sense water, so they'll go out or down depending on where the water's at. Homeostasis in a plant. Now again, we're going to use the example of temperature here. So when a plant gets too hot, instead of being able to, it's going to shrivel up or basically wilt away if it gets too hot. So it actually has little holes in its leaves that allow water to escape, and basically it's like sweating for humans. When the water kind of evaporates, it cools the plant down. So that's the way the plant can actually keep its temperature basically balanced. And finally, one of the more easier ones, use of energy for a plant. The plant uses energy from the sun to make sugar, and then it can then use that sugar to get energy for all its cells inside the plant. Alright, moving on to these cells and life. We're going to talk about cell theory now. So, the main 3 points of cell theory. Number 1 are all living things are made of cells. 2 says the cell is the basic unit of life, which we're going to break that down. That means a cell is the smallest living thing, and anything smaller than a cell is not considered living. So things that are inside the cell, or things like atoms or molecules, are technically not considered alive. And part 3 of cell theory says cells come from other cells. Alright, now cell theory is kind of a strange concept, and that's okay. What I want you to know is that cell theory, all of this stuff we're talking about as cells, did not just happen overnight. It's the combined work of many scientists and inventors over about 300 years. And it wasn't just one person who figured all of this stuff out. People had to work together, and there was many different collaborators on this, as you saw from your cell theory timeline. One of the main people I want to talk about was Robert Hooke. He was the person that named cells, because he looked at cork, you can see on the screen, and he thought they looked like little rooms. And that's kind of the word cell, like jail cell, it means a little room. So that's what he named them for. So I just want you to know that we didn't always know about cells. It might kind of make you feel better knowing that we didn't always know that cells existed. So trying to learn all of this stuff in about 10 weeks of school can be a little frustrating, but that's okay. As long as you're getting kind of the grasp of it, that's all I'm expecting for you right now. So what is the cell? We said before, the cell is the basic or simplest unit of life. And elaborating on that a little bit more, we could say that a cell is the smallest structural and functional unit of an organism. That means basically if you were to take everything from a living organism, the smallest thing that you could still consider to be part of that organism, a living thing, would be a cell. So you can kind of think of it as like a Lego analogy that I've used in class. Think of it like building a Lego structure. That's like your organism. Well, the smallest structural unit of that building that you built out of Legos is going to be one little Lego brick, an actual brick. Anything smaller than that, like if you had just like a broken piece of Lego, technically it's not a full functioning Lego anymore, so you can't even build with it anymore. So it's no longer a part of your structure. It's no longer a living part of the organism. Also, is a cell living? Yes, it is. From the organization characteristics of life, it said that all living things are made of cells. And since that a single cell is made of cells, it's a cell is a cell, so then it is living. Also, organisms can be unicellular. So bacteria, for example, they are considered living. If it's just even one cell, it's considered living. All right, what is a cell? A cell's job is to produce chemicals for the body based on the DNA, and it's carrying out its function for the whole organism. So, for example, blood carries oxygen throughout the body, and nerves carry signals from nerves to the brain. So, all of these different cells have a certain function, and they're designed specifically to carry out that function. Some types of cells we've talked about. First thing was eukaryotic cells. That means with a nucleus or with organelles, and they can be broken down into two categories that we've talked about. Alright, so let's start for animal cells. Let's start with looking at the nucleus. So the nucleus of the cell is basically controlling everything that goes on in the cell. It's kind of like the brain of the cell, or the boss of the cell. It controls everything going on. And it actually holds DNA, and the DNA is what the body and the cell itself is using to produce these chemicals that it's trying to make. Next thing up, it would be the cell membrane. Cell membrane is kind of along the outside of the cell, and it's basically controlling what goes in and out of the cell. So it's kind of keeping the stuff in, as well as keeping harmful stuff out of the cell. Next up, we have cytoplasm. That's the kind of inside jelly-like stuff. It kind of acts as like a cushion, kind of protecting the cell from like impacts and stuff like that. Also, it holds the organelles in place, and it kind of provides a place for all these chemical reactions and things to happen and things to move around inside the cell. And finally, the mitochondria. The mitochondria is, we call it like the powerhouse of the cell. It's basically responsible for providing energy for the cell. So it breaks down sugar into energy. Next up, we have plant cells. Now, it's important to note that the plant cell has the same organelles as an animal cell. The plant cell just has 3 extra ones that we didn't talk about with the animal cell. So, first one being the cell wall. The cell wall goes along the outside of the cell, kind of like the cell membrane, but the cell wall kind of provides protection and support to the cell, and it even gives the plant cell its distinct shape. So we typically see a plant cell looking kind of rectangular, like kind of bricks in a brick wall when you look at a slide of plant cells under the microscope. It's the cell wall that gives it that certain shape. Next up, we have the vacuole. The vacuole is responsible for storing things for the cell, such as waste or water or food. And something interesting, we point out a vacuole specifically for plant cell because plant cells have one large vacuole. Animal cells also have vacuoles, which you probably saw in the last slide, but for plant cells, we make a distinction because it's so big and you can sometimes even see it. Finally, for organelles, we have the chloroplast in the plant cell. Now, chloroplast, like mitochondria, helps the plant cell make energy, but it does it kind of in an indirect way. So the chloroplast is using sunlight to make sugar for the plant, and then later on the mitochondria can use that sugar to make energy. So there's kind of like a in-between step. So chloroplast is what's responsible for carrying on photosynthesis that helps the plant make sugar, which eventually gets energy. Right, from a cell to an organism. Multicellular organisms have some work to do. One cell cannot do all the different functions for the body, so they kind of have to divide up the work that they're doing. So different cells are going to have a specific job to do in the body. And here you can see some examples. We have one cell would have formed such things as like nerve cells or blood cells or muscle cells, depending on what its real purpose is. Cells that perform the same job can be grouped together, and that's going to be called a tissue. Muscle cells can combine to form your skeletal muscle tissue in your arm, for example. Some other examples include muscle tissue in your heart, skin tissue, like on the outside of your body, brain tissue made up of many brain cells called neurons, and finally bone tissue. Next, we can group tissues together. They can be grouped based on their jobs as well. So all muscle tissue causes movement, and then so muscle tissue is different depending on its job though. So just because it's all muscle tissue does not mean it's all the same. Doesn't mean they have the same job. Complex jobs in a body may need more than one type of tissue. For example, your heart needs muscle tissue for the heart valves and cells that keep it beating on time. So there's 3 types of tissue right there. All those tissues have to combine then and form one thing called the organ. So for example, your heart is an organ. Again, there's a lot of work to be done with only one organ, so your body divides up the work again. Finally, organs can work together to make up an organ system, and that's our final level basically for this. An organ system, for example, we were just talking about the heart. So the heart is a part of the circulatory system. Circulatory system moves oxygen and nutrients throughout your body in the blood. So it circulates everything throughout the body. Another example would be the digestive system. Contains organs like the esophagus and the stomach and the intestines. All organs working together to kind of get nutrients out of the food that you eat. In the end, all your body systems work together to keep you alive, and they're what make up the whole organism. So our final level of this whole organization system of cells to multicellular organisms takes us to the whole organism itself. So just as a review of what we just talked about, things in your body start off as cells, so there's a bunch of different types of cells. In this case, we're going to talk about just a single muscle cell. And we can group different muscle cells together. Groups of cells that form the same job or have the same job can be grouped together to form tissues. So I have a picture there of muscle tissue. And then if you have different tissues coming together, like connective tissue and muscle tissue, then those tissues can come together to form an organ. So I have a heart, for an example, and then different organs may come together and then those form an organ system. So for example, there's a picture of the circulatory system, which would move blood and all that stuff throughout your body. You can see all the veins and stuff throughout the body. And finally, different organ systems could come together. So for example, your body is made up of circulatory system, digestive system, respiratory system, ton more. Those all come together and work together to form the whole organism. And it's just another way to think about it too. Think of a cell as like a brick, and then you can put multiple bricks together, and those bricks are all doing the same job, and they're forming a wall. So the wall is like a tissue. And then if you put multiple walls together, that can form a room, and then finally rooms form, like we're talking about an apartment building, so like the one whole floor of an apartment building. And then if you put multiple floors together, you get the entire building. That's like our organism. So that's just another way to think about it. Just kind of building up from the small to the more complex is what I'm talking about. All right, that's it. You just reviewed 10 weeks of school in under 20 minutes. Good luck on your test.